All right, kids. 2 left. Hard to believe we are ripping right through the summer. Hey, I realized when I put my, those of you who were here a few weeks ago, that picture of me from my CIA days when I was 14 on the screen, I should have saved it for tonight, but I'm not going to make you suffer through it again. But it reminded me of a story, and especially given the title of David's book. So when I was 14, my grandparents took my cousin Eben and I on a trip that included 3 days in what was then Leningrad. And while we were there, we were the two of us, and we thought we were pretty cool. We're standing on this corner. I don't know where my grandparents were, but they weren't far away. Well, this guy sidles up next to us, and he says to my cousin, would we be interested in trading dollars for rubles? And the best of my recollection, $1 was worth about 2 in those days, I think, and he was offering 3. And my cousin, who he asked, without missing a beat, said, well, I don't have any money, but my cousin might. And all I could think of was, you know what? The two of us are going to disappear, and nobody, including my grandparents, are ever going to see us again. And they're going to have to get back and explain to my mom and dad and his parents what happened to David and Eben. So fortunately, we didn't trade any money, and we managed to make it through it okay. But it was just a fun little story that I had forgotten, because this was, whatever it is now, 55 years ago. So anyway, we have a great program tonight, and I'm happy to introduce, first of all, Courtney Bond from the church to welcome us, and then Richard will introduce David McCloskey, and I will see you at the end.
Thanks, David. I think I missed the memo on the dress code for this evening. It is wonderful to welcome you here to Highland Park United Methodist Church and this Rejebian summer series. As David said, my name is Courtney Bond. I am one of the pastors to the sanctuary. That means you may recognize me on Sunday mornings at the other side of the building in a robe, around talking to people, occasionally leading worship on the chancel, sometimes even in the pulpit. But I am also a mom to a 4-year-old who attends the day school here. So you may recognize me from running around out in the parking lot, chasing after her while you are trying to park for Rejebian. One of my many roles, but one of my favorite about being the pastor to the sanctuary, is that I get to meet with a lot of people. That's a big part of what I do. And sometimes it's meeting with people who are new to the community, new to our congregation, trying to get them involved or plugged into the various ministries that we offer here. Sometimes it's meeting with longtime attendees, with members, talking and praying with one another about their spiritual journeys, both in times of joy and in certainty when their faith is rock solid, and then also in times of hardship and of doubt. And then I also have a connection with our online community for our sanctuary, where I provide weekly touch points in Facebook or Instagram, letting folks know about what kind of sermon series might be coming up or the various ways that you could get involved with the sanctuary community. And I met with a young couple not too long ago who was planning on baptizing their little girl. And they wanted to know, they're like, what is your favorite thing about the sanctuary community? And I thought for a second, and I said, one of the things I love most, and one of the things that I am constantly blessed by, is looking out into the pews on Sunday morning and seeing so many different people in different stages and seasons of life. I mean, there are little kids, there are teenagers, there are parents, grandparents, empty nesters, parents who have their kids over at SMU and they're coming to check us out, people who have worshiped with us from across across the nation or across the globe online who have come in town to worship in person on that particular moment. And then singles who come together to be a part of the same small group or Sunday morning class who sit together. We have all kinds of different people who are in different seasons and stages of their life. But on Sunday morning, we all gather together to worship, and it is a sacred and a holy experience. If you have questions about the sanctuary or want to know about ways to get involved in the sanctuary community or just in our church as a whole, please reach out to me. I would love to meet you and to talk with you. At this point now, we will enter into a time of prayer together. So I ask you now, will you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this hot summer night. We give you thanks for this opportunity to gather together in community. God, we give you thanks tonight that yours is not just a house of worship on Sunday mornings, but it is a church where people can gather throughout the week, where we can share a meal, read a book, engage with an author. And in doing so, God, we strengthen our bonds of fellowship and friendship, making us, God, better neighbors with all of those we encounter. So, God, I pray that you would just bless us this evening and bless our time together and be with us, oh God. Remind us in all that we do and all that we say that we are ambassadors of your love and your grace. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we pray. Amen. At this point, I'll invite Richard up. There's Richard.
Well, we know David McCloskey because David was here a couple of years ago with Moscow X tonight. He was here with Damascus Station. And that one got Best Summer Reads, a finalist for Best First Novel. I mean, he was off and running. It's fun to have somebody in our community who has a national footprint now in thriller stuff. Maybe what really persuaded me was when David Petraeus said it was the best spy novel he'd ever read. You know, if David Petraeus is impressed, I'm impressed. But basically, David McCloskey, CIA, all over the Middle East, you know, an analyst. He basically briefed the White House with the daily briefings, spoke to congressional committees on top secret kind of stuff. I mean, he was in the midst of all of that. He's a Johns Hopkins graduate, smart guy, but he brings to his spy thriller fiction real life information, you know, that informs all his novels. And I will say, my favorite thing about David was a couple years ago when D Magazine did At Home with the McCloskeys. You know his wife, Abby. She is a columnist for the Dallas Morning News. She's been a political advisor to several presidential candidates. And together they make kind of a couple that's really fabulous to know. You know. So, but tonight is Moscow X. And remember, Moscow X, Brian from Interrobang is up there. David will be signing copies, personalizing them after this. So be sure to get your copy of Moscow X. I'm not going to say any more. Welcome, David McCloskey.
Thanks so much. All right. Everyone hear me? Thanks so much for having me back. And for the very kind introduction. I'm just delighted to be back in front of you after a few years. And I can already tell, even though I've been on the stage for all of like 10 seconds and been introduced, that this talk is already going to go better than one of the last ones I gave in Dallas a couple weeks ago because of this, and it's a strange reason, because there's a podium. So which I kind of like. I mean, I'll move around a bit, but it's nice to have something to kind of anchor you. And I was doing a talk on my books a bit ago here in Dallas. I won't name where, although after I finish, you might be able to guess. And the room where I was going to do the talk was not kind of normally set up for book talks or any kind of talk. It was kind of a boardroom type setup. So I show up, and it's very clear that we're going to have to move furniture around to make this work. So me and some of the facilities people are kind of moving some of the furniture around, getting chairs set up. And I like, as I said, I like to have a podium, and I noticed that there's kind of a stand that's off in a corner of the room. It's not a podium, but it's about the right height. And so I go over there, and I look at it, and there's a collection of what look like Bed Bath & Beyond kind of rocks on it. And it doesn't look particularly interesting to me. I like heft this thing up. It's very, very heavy, heavier than it looks. And I kind of dump it in a corner by the fireplace. Don't think anything else of it. Pull the podium over to the middle of the room. We have the place set up. Now, the facilities person who had kind of invited us to use this room was a little bit perturbed when she came in and saw the amount of rearranging we'd done. But then her eyes kind of lock on the empty podium, and she looks at me and she's like, "My God, what have you done with the dinosaur eggs?" And it turned out that the rocks were like 95 million year old fossilized hadrosaur eggs and were quite expensive. And she was not amused by having them set over by the fireplace. So as you can imagine, the vibes to start that talk were quite bad. And I'm already glad that this is going better tonight. So I thought what I'd do is talk just a little bit about me and my journey kind of into and through and then out of the CIA. And then we'd talk a little bit about my writing, and then actually the agency itself, the CIA, sort of what is it not, and what are some of the major challenges that I think are really facing it today. So a little bit about me. I got into the agency very young. I was 19 when I was recruited. They showed up. I don't have a particularly sexy recruitment story. They showed up on my college campus. I was going to a place called Wheaton College, which is a small Protestant liberal arts school outside of Chicago. The CIA showed up to my International Relations 101 class doing a campus recruitment. And at the time, my resume had really two principal jobs on it. I had been a hole digger for a sprinkler system company in the Minneapolis-St. Paul suburbs. This is all true. And I'd been a cashier at Wendy's. And so, of course, I thought, well, this is a very natural sort of progression, clearly. But this is kind of an interesting step up. I wanted to travel. I wanted to see the world. I wanted to know how the world worked. And so, of course, I applied thinking there's absolutely no way that I'm going to get in, but I'll put my name in the hat and see what happens. And it turns out that if you go to kind of small Christian, Protestant, liberal arts schools outside of Chicago, you are good at passing polygraphs. You haven't committed any of the really major sins that would disqualify you. And you also, despite the Protestantism, have a very Catholic sort of baseload level of guilt that makes them understand that you're not a sociopath when they're giving you that test. So I sort of walked this narrow path in, and I join in 2006. I get put on the team working on Syria. I didn't know anything about Syria at the time. They put me on the team, I guess, figuring he's young and he'll figure it out. And for the first few years working on that topic, it was relatively sleepy, right? And then starting in the spring of 2011, it wasn't anymore. And now this whole period has kind of fallen out of certainly our headlines, but really our public consciousness. Is there was a massive wave of unrest that spread across much of the Arab world that year. And in Syria, that started in this kind of really hopeful spirit that this really brutal government would be swept aside, would be changed, would be forced to give its people more sort of rights and dignity. And of course, what ended up happening was a really brutal spiral into civil unrest, civil war, and eventually state failure. The whole place was tremendously shattered and broken down to its deepest level. And again, I think this is something that we've sort of forgotten here, but it was a population of 23 million people. Half of those people were displaced internally or fled the country over the course of the war. About 500,000 people were killed in the first 5 years of the war, and the UN stopped counting in about 2016. The poverty rate's like 80, 90%, and it's really just kind of a warlord economy and system now. And that experience for me, kind of watching that happen as a relatively young person, was a very emotionally kind of shattering and very profound event, because I had lived in Damascus, I had worked on Syria pretty much my whole time at the CIA. And when I left the agency, for reasons that I even still can't really explain now, I just started to write about it. And I was in this period of 3 or 4 months of leaving the agency job and coming down here to Dallas. My wife and I were getting ready to move to take another job down here. And I just started to write every day. And I found it wasn't a book then. It was more like a journal entry or a way to kind of work through what I had seen and lived through. And I had no intention at that time of ever publishing it. I thought, this is for me. There's some interesting stuff in here, interesting characters, stories, but I'm going to print this thing out, put it in, a drawer, and never see it again. Come down here, we moved to Dallas, and I had in the back of my mind, even though it was totally impossible with the consulting job I was doing, I had in the back of my mind that I really would like at some point to go back to that writing, because the act of sitting there, of actually putting my thoughts down on the page, of actually putting words on the page, to me was the closest I'd ever come to getting really into flow and to feeling like I could understand sort of what was going on inside me and in the world. And I had an opportunity a few years, really 5 years after we moved here, to take some time away from that consulting job and to start writing again. And so I dusted off that old kind of manuscript. And I had initially thought, because I remembered enjoying writing it, that it would be kind of good. And it turned out it was really bad when I went back to it. I mean, it was not readable in any way, shape, or form. I mean, if you want to write a spy novel, you sort of need a plot, that didn't have it. You need good characters that are, sort of on a journey throughout, didn't have those. But I went back to it, and I said, okay, I'm going to write a book that is authentic to Syria and authentic to the CIA. And that book really became my first novel, which is Damascus Station, which came out in 2021. Now, last year, Moscow X came out, that by its title, of course, is not about Syria. It's set in sort of modern-day Russia. And my third book, which is called The Seventh Floor, will be coming out on October 1st this year. They're all kind of in the same universe, right? There's characters that move between them. It's not a series in the sense of like Jack Ryan 1, 2, 3, 4, but they're connected. But I think that maybe the most consistent through line in my writing, and the thing that I'm really trying, insofar as I'm attempting to kind of communicate a theme or an idea through it, is how can I get the CIA right? How can I not just get the operations right and the tradecraft and the lingo, but at a deeper level, can I get the cultural code, the kind of ethos, the moral ethic of the place right, and show the good and the bad? And so I thought what we'd do, before we kind of jump into what the CIA is just do a little bit of a, let's baseline where we're sort of all collectively at in our CIA knowledge. And I'm going to put up a piece of sort of tradecraft or a detail about the CIA and a description, and we can sort of figure out, okay, is it fact or is it fiction, to kind of test our knowledge. So CIA hot dog machine. This is a vending machine for hot dogs at Langley. It's exactly what it sounds like. What do we think? Fact or fiction? Fact. Kind of too weird to not be a fact, right? Like, I'd have to be deranged to make that up. It is a fact. There was a vending machine for hot dogs that was in the Langley basement for many years when I worked there. The number I consumed is a highly classified piece of information that I'll never share. And it was there because the cafeteria would close at like 4:30 p.m. And if you got stuck there late, you were eating hot dogs. I mean, that was pretty much the only option. Okay, CIA officers wearing, tuxedos and martinis, kind of dressed to the nines. What do we think? Fiction. Come on. Fiction, yeah. So one of my colleagues who was in for about 33 years said the only time he ever wore a tuxedo while he was at the CIA was to his daughter's wedding. That was the only time. Okay, Q level tech. Q is, of course, the sort of gadget master from the James Bond franchise. Lipstick guns, suicide pills, dragonfly-sized listing drones, and exploding cigars. What do we think? Fact or fiction? Okay. Now, I put fact, but I'd say it's fact-ish. It's sort of true-ish. All of these things are true, by the way, and there's some really incredible tech that the CIA develops. But a lot of the stuff in the movies is actually just completely made up. So I'd say fact-ish. Okay, roadkill dead drops. Okay, a drop site, you need flow to sort of move through and pick something up. You need it to be concealed, and what a better place to hide something than inside a dead cat? What do we think? Okay. Yeah, again, it's too weird. So it's a fact. And we don't do that anymore because the agents didn't want to reach inside a dead cat to put stuff in. So they killed that idea. But they did try for a while. Okay, car chases, right? Hunting or running from the bad guys, usually in a very interesting sports car. Okay, this one's totally fiction. If you're in a car chase at the agency, things went horribly wrong. I don't know a single colleague who has been in one, in fact. Not one. Okay, last one, the Kennedy assassination. Was the CIA involved? That one's still top secret. We can't talk about that one. We can't do that one tonight. Okay, so I think we did pretty well. So before we kind of get into the agency, I'm going to make the claim that there's kind of two primary ways that most people who are outside the secret world kind of look into it. And the first one is Hollywood, right? It's what a recent book is called spy entertainment, which is really, really big business. I mean, there are massive film and book franchises that sell, hundreds of millions of copies and make billions of dollars that are all trading on the mystique of the CIA and that show a world of kind of superhero spies, right? People who are doing all of the things on the slide that I just showed. They're in car chases, they're dressed really well, they're above average looks and intelligence, and they're wielding guns in almost every scene, right? And that can be quite fun. It can be quite entertaining. I was immensely disappointed when I joined to discover that's not what it was going to be like. And it's just totally inaccurate, right? And again, it's not to disparage any of that entertainment, much of which I consume, but it's merely to say that when we look at the CIA through that lens, we don't really see what it is. The other way that I think many of us kind of look at this place is through leaks, controversies, oftentimes conspiracy theories about things the agency's done in the past, that some of it can be true, certainly, but it's sort of like that story of people putting their hands on an elephant and kind of thinking it's one thing, but actually you don't have the picture of the whole. And I think if you primarily look at the CIA through this lens, you're going to miss the picture of what the place actually is. And it's not to say that we shouldn't focus on some of these things or hold the CIA accountable when it screws up. It's merely to say that if we look at it through Hollywood or we look at it through conspiracy theories, controversy leaks, we're not really grasping the essence of the place. And so what I want to do is I want to walk a little bit quickly here through a CIA 101 of kind of what is the history of the place in a nutshell, how's it set up, and then what does it actually do? So there's obviously the books, massive books written about the history of the CIA. I have it in one slide here. If I could leave you with one thought, it's that over its history, the CIA has gone from an organization of pirates to an organization of lawyers. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the first years of the agency, it's founded in 1947. If you look at the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s, you have an organization that is operating without a whole lot of oversight from Congress or even the president in many cases. His budget's pretty unclear. And it's essentially operating as the president's black bag outfit. This is an era of kind of wink and nod stuff from the president, and the CIA goes and tries to make it happen, right? And in the mid-70s, there's a set of congressional kind of committee hearings, come to be known as Church Pike, that begin this process of kind of institutionalizing the CIA. On the previous slide, there's a picture of Frank Church holding up a gun. He's holding up a heart attack gun the CIA built, and it was designed to shoot pellets that had this sort of distilled shellfish toxin in them, and it would hit somebody on their skin, and it would look like they had a heart attack. It was poisoned. So the CIA was sort of engaged in these kind of activities, and Church Pike really starts to bring an end to that. And there's a series of actual laws and executive orders in the 70s and the 80s that start to really institutionalize in a much deeper way the CIA, create the modern structure we have of congressional oversight, and create a system that's much more lawyerly and legalistic and bureaucratic than had existed before. And many of the conspiracy theories, or frankly, the views that exist or sort of permeate the culture today about the CIA are from that pre-Church Pike period. Now, the organization itself. So the way you should think about the Central Intelligence Agency is a little bit like how you'd think about the military's structure with its combatant commands. So down the left here, we have what are called mission centers. The CIA is looking at the globe, and they organize themselves into these mission centers based on intelligence priorities. China, counterterrorism, right? Counter weapons, counterproliferation, things like that. On the top are the functions inside the Central Intelligence Agency: operations, analysis, support, digital innovation, which is a new one, and science and technology. And you could think about all of those as sort of equivalent to the different services in our military, Army, Navy, Air Force, that resource and support the mission centers that go out and do the work of the Central Intelligence Agency in the world. Now, one thing you'll note about this org chart is that there aren't too many assassins or black ops killers on it, right? The work of the CIA is, we have paramilitary officers, and there are pieces of the Central Intelligence Agency that certainly do work that resembles that. But it is a very small piece of what the agency does. The vast majority of the work of the Central Intelligence Agency is focused on operations and analysis. And so, okay, I was a CIA analyst. What is the CIA? What does that mean? Like, what's the CIA actually doing? And the best way that I can think of to describe it, to give you kind of a mental model of what the CIA is to think about it like clandestine journalism. And think about the work of an investigative journalist, right? They are, and let's take an example of one who is looking at a story about corporate malfeasance, a business who's done something illegal or immoral. Well, they'll start with sort of a question that they want to answer that's relevant to their readership and their customers, right? That's going to be read by the people who buy the paper. An analyst, the CIA, will say, okay, I worked on Syria. A question might be, at the start of the unrest in Syria in 2011, how long can Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, hang on to power? Right? That's a question that was deeply interesting to the president at that period of time. Now, to answer that question, you're going to need sources. And take the corporate example again. That investigative journalist is going to want to go out and basically find people who have the secrets of that business and get them to provide those secrets to the journalists so they can use them in their story. The bread and butter of what the CIA is doing is finding people who have access to information that we want in Russia, in Syria, in Iran, in China, wherever, and convincing them. It could be because of ideology, it could be because of money, it could be for complicated psychological reasons, it's sometimes all of those, to give us that information. And then you think, well, you have this source, let's say, how do you actually communicate with them? Because you shouldn't be talking to them. So how in the world do you set up a system where you can actually pass information back and forth? How do you vet them? Because it's sort of stock and trade in the business to understand that people who are committing treason and betraying their country and their organization are oftentimes not emotionally well. How do you understand what can be trusted and what can't be? And once you have that information, well, you're going to get some stuff from other sources too, aren't you? You're going to get potentially satellite imagery. You're going to get intercepts of phone calls, text messages, emails, faxes. You're going to get access to stolen documents. You're going to get a huge amount of information. And you're going to put that information together, again, on this question, And a lot of it's not going to make any sense. It's going to be contradictory. Some of it is worth more than other bits of it. And so you have analysts who sort through all of this and basically on that question try to write up a report, which oftentimes could be less than a page, that says what's going on, why is it happening, and what does it mean for the United States? Sort of so what? And that analysis needs to be apolitical, non-value-laden, objective, and very clear on how you come and how we came as the CIA to our judgments. It never has anyone's name on it. It just is written by the CIA. It's an organizational product. And then, of course, you got to go through, as any good journalist would, a massive sort of editorial review, layers and layers of review, fact-checking, and then how do you actually position this with your customers? And so the whole process is actually very, very similar to that of an investigative journalist putting out a piece of investigative journalism. And so when you think about what's a CIA analyst doing, what's a CIA operations officer doing, they're contributing to this exact flow, day in and day out. But when you go down a level into the sort of culture or the moral code of the organization itself, I think that's where the analogy with the newsroom and journalism really breaks down. Because the CIA, it does not have the moral ethic, the code of the Washington Post or the New York Times. It's just not the same. And I think the best kind of model I can give you for how you should think about the CIA at the deepest level is that it is a uniquely bipolar organization. And what I mean by that is that on the one hand, it has an exceptional and high-stakes mission that really doesn't have any comparable, there's no other organization out there that's really doing the same thing, at least in the United States. And then on the other hand, it's a massive government bureaucracy. And I will never forget the day when I realized that this was true. I'd actually been working there for a couple years before I ever had any sense of this. But there was a day when I was led downstairs, I got read into a new operation. And I went downstairs into this room in the basement, windowless, that I'd never been down there before. It's one of these classic Langley rooms where it's completely unlabeled. I mean, you have no idea what or who is working in there. And I go in, and up on the screens is footage of a surveillance drone hovering over one of our adversaries' most secretive military installations. And I remember thinking at the time, like, that this was beyond anything that I'd even seen in like a spy movie. It was crazy. I was totally blown away. And it was one of the first times that it had happened to me. And I go upstairs and I'm working later that day on something totally different. And I printed out some documents and I realized I didn't have a stapler on my desk. And so I go over to the office supply cabinet, and I look in there and there's no staplers. And I'm walking back, and one of my friends kind of wheels out of his cubicle. And he's like, "You're looking for staplers, aren't you?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "There aren't any. Someone screwed up the procurement, the like office supply procurement order, and there was like a massive shortage of basic office supplies for a period. And we ended up having to go down to like other floors of the building and steal office supplies from other teams." And I remember sitting there that day thinking, I don't understand how the same organization that put that drone up in the air, that built all the tech, that figured out how to fly that thing in a place where no one can see it, and we can literally see these, this is a while ago now, we can literally see the people's badges and the color of their eyes and all this, and yet we don't have staplers. Like, how is that place real? But it is, and I think anytime you see a spy film or anything like that, just be aware that the best stuff, ideally, is going to deal with both of these things at exactly the same time because they're true day in and day out at the CIA. Now, on the bureaucratic side, okay, one of the things that I like to point out is the CIA does actually have a gift shop, which sounds kind of stupid and absurd when you say it initially, but then you realize, well, Southwest Airlines has a gift shop, don't they? That's a big organization. AT&T has a gift shop. That's a big organization. The Central Intelligence Agency has a gift shop. And a lot of the stuff at this gift shop is exactly what you would expect. golf balls, shot glasses, mugs, pens, all this kind of stuff. Some of it is very weird. I can attest. Like, it is very strange stuff. So they have barbecue sauce, which they say is classified. You can't take it out of the cafeteria. They have trench coats, which are bizarrely not even marketed in an ironic way. It's like just in the clothing section, it doesn't even say CIA on it. And my favorite was that, and I even as a 20-year-old looked at this and thought, this is ridiculous. They used to have, although my sources tell me they no longer sell this, they used to have luggage that said CIA across it in massive gold letters. And there was a little sign below it that had clearly been written by some desperate, cashier in the gift shop that said, if you work at the CIA, you can't buy this, basically. You cannot travel with it. So there's a gift shop, right? Makes sense. On another bureaucratic note, the CIA, like its managers, spend vast amounts of their day writing what are called cables, which is essentially a fancy way of saying email. Communicating back and forth about an operation, having meetings about that operation, doing all the things that if you were watching, middle to upper management, a Fortune 500 company, what's taking up their time during the day, that's what CIA officers are doing. One of my good friends at the agency, who's a longtime operations officer, said he walked into he was very new at the time, he walked into one of his trainer's offices, and his trainer was hunched over a keyboard, and he said, look at me, I'm spying real hard right now. Click, 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 click. Like, that is a huge amount of the work, is sending these cables back and forth. Another thing which is kind of weird about, because it's a public bureaucracy, is that you're not supposed to use taxpayer funds for parties. So one of the bizarre things about the Middle East kind of analytic office's holiday or Christmas parties was that you can't just go out and buy, you certainly can't bring alcohol in, and you're not supposed to. And everybody, including very senior officers, are contributing. So it has this feel of kind of like a low-rent church potluck at a site that's off of Langley's campus. And you have really senior people, some of them have done amazing things, who are like making casserole and brownies and all these different things and bringing them to our holiday parties. It's the opposite of, the Jack Ryan picture I was showing you earlier. But at the same time, the CIA's job description is, we're trying to disrupt terrorist attacks. And I've been part of operations where we've literally stopped them in near real time. We're stealing state secrets from our competitors, from the Russians and the Chinese, trying to get access to their most closely guarded secrets. We're developing and fielding cutting-edge technology to make that happen. We're running agents in incredibly denied environments, places like Iran and North Korea and China, who are risking their lives and their hailing officers' lives to bring this information to us. We're running covert action and influence programs, and we're writing that top-secret, highly classified newspaper for the president almost every day. And so I don't say any of these things to sort of puff the CIA up. It's just to say that at the same time as we have all that other stuff, this is the job description that this organization is hopefully, trying to achieve every day. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the major challenges facing the CIA, but I do think it's actually important to talk a little bit about why the CIA is actually important. Right? It's kind of a basic and almost fundamental question, but I think it's really relevant when we think about why are we spending so much time and energy on this place? Why do we spend taxpayer money on the Central Intelligence Agency? And the best way that I can give you to think about it is that the CIA, if it's functioning properly, should be giving us an information advantage over hostile powers, or just frankly over anyone in the world. That information advantage is exactly what we're after, because we want to know more about Chinese military capabilities. We want to know more about Xi Jinping's plans and intentions than they know about us. And it's critical to our national security and to our position geopolitically to have the best possible information. So that's really the role that the CIA is trying to play, is how can we put the news, as it were, about what is in Xi Jinping's head, what kind of capabilities his military might be fielding, just to use a China example. How can we give that information to our president, to our policymakers, so that they can make the best possible decisions about national security? And I think, I'm a recovering consultant, which is much of what I was doing here in Dallas. And I was always told that if you put up a slide and you've got 2 things, it meant you haven't really thought hard enough about the problem. And if you had 4, you were overcomplicating it. So I've put 3 up here, although I could have chosen a great many. And I think these are close to the biggest themes, though. One is technology, right? And that is a big bucket, clearly. What do I mean by that? Well, we could be talking about how does the CIA conduct offensive cyber attacks against, our adversaries? Or I could be talking about how does the CIA defend against them? Could be talking about how are they trying to field artificial intelligence and harness it, in analysis and operations. But one piece of this, which I think is really interesting and critical to the functioning of the agency, and that doesn't get a lot of ink spilled on it, is this concept of ubiquitous technical surveillance, or what we call UTS. And what I mean by that is basically it's kind of 3 things added together. The first one is the massive proliferation of cameras, sensors, phones, primarily all around us, and all of our devices that are with us at all times, that are with us as we're driving, that are in our cars, plus the ability to take all of that data and to store it really cheaply and easily. Decades ago, a couple gigs of data would have, to store that would have been millions of dollars and a piece of hardware the size of a refrigerator. And now you fit all that basically for free on something much smaller than your fingernail, right? Plus the ability to analyze all of that information with really effective tools, many of which are powered or enabled by artificial intelligence. So you can start to make sense of all of this data. And what it means for the CIA is that if you think about collecting human intelligence, that piece of that clandestine journalism kind of graph that I showed, that information acquisition part, we're actually trying to go out and find people who have secrets that we want and convince them to give them to us. Well, to do that, you have to be able to communicate with them. And you typically have to be able, at some point, to meet with them. And it had been the case for much of the Cold War, and until very recently, that to go meet with an asset, you had to conduct something called a surveillance detection route, which meant that you would move from point A, wherever you're starting, to the site where you're meeting over typically a long period of time, and conducting a series of moves that all sort of fit within your pattern of life, so someone watching thinks it's totally normal. But throughout, you are checking constantly, using a bunch of different techniques about how you move through space over time, how you turn, how you look, to see if a team is watching you, if someone is watching you. And it used to be the case that if you pulled that off and you met with the asset and you got the information and you went home, you had a beer, you could relax because you knew that you were black, which meant that you weren't under surveillance when you went to that meeting. And now, because of UTS, essentially opposing or hostile intelligence services can months later just go back through the data and potentially catch you. So that relationship with time is totally changed. And so there is now, it's impossible, I think, to overstate the impact that this is having on really spy services all over the world to collect human intelligence. It's totally changed the game. And so it's not really like, it's sort of like asking, well, how do you not get wet, in the rain? It's like you're going to, it's just a question of how do you adapt, right? It's all around us. The second point I would make is on geopolitics. Now, it'd been the case for a generation, really since 9/11, that the CIA was spending a huge amount of its budget, its resources, its time, its best manpower on the counterterrorism mission, fighting against Al-Qaeda, supporting the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we're seeing now is the need, because of Russian sort of revanchism, because of China's rising power and capability and sort of intent to have more control and sway in East Asia, and because of what we're seeing the Iranians do in the Middle East, there is now sort of this revenge of geopolitics, this return of competition for power and influence with state actors. That is a critical piece of the CIA's ability to sort of be relevant and to maintain that information advantage over the coming decades is going to be, can we turn the ship and can we focus back on that mission? Can we go back to having our best people working on Russia and China? Can we support a pipeline of people who actually speak these languages, have experience there, and can work the target? Can we reorganize ourselves internally so that we're spending most of our time and resources and our budget on these targets? And I think there have been some great moves by the CIA in recent years to do that, but it's sort of this, it's a big bureaucracy. It's a turn of a ship. How do you make sure that you're aligned to the actual priorities and national security interests of the United States? And the very last point I'll make, which I think is one that I think it hits closest to home, at least for me, is this idea that we're living in a cultural moment where it's increasingly difficult to even know if basic facts that we hear are true. We're in an information environment that's very fragmented, very fractured. It's very polarized, and in many cases, it's very politicized, particularly in an election year. And the net result of that is just that it can be, you'd be forgiven for thinking at times that the truth doesn't really exist anymore, right? And so, the CIA's really business is finding the truth. And I think that the environment we're in is sort of having this effect, broadly speaking, of reducing trust in so many of our institutions, and I think the CIA in particular. And so I wanted to close with a story to kind of bring that point home. So it was about a week or so into my time at the CIA, my training instructor, a guy named Steve, who'd been in for almost 3 decades, took my class down to the original headquarters building lobby, which you can see on the left-hand picture there, that seal. You've probably seen this in movies before. There's typically a scene in a spy movie where the protagonist kind of walks across the seal with intent and there's like bustle all around them. And it works well in the movies, but in reality, the place is actually pretty somber and quiet, in large part because there isn't parking nearby, so people just don't go in that entrance. It's pretty quiet. And so we go in there, and you look up on one wall, and it's the memorial wall. This is a wall of, I believe it's 140 stars that are etched into the marble. Each one represents a CIA officer who died in the line of duty. And many of those stars, even to this day, don't have names attached to them because whatever that person was doing when they passed whatever operation they were on is still highly classified. So it's a very somber, very reflective place. And then if you kind of turn around, you see this wall, which is this picture on the right. And it has up there a verse from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 32, which says, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And as a barely a 20-year-old at that point, I remember thinking, I kind of don't get this, because isn't this place all about skullduggery and deception and secrets? Like, what does the truth kind of have to do with any of this? And I remember Steve, the trainer, telling me, kind of pointing back at that memorial wall and saying, look, the reality of those stars is that all of those people died in search of the truth. This whole place exists, and when it's operating in its most effective way, it exists to speak truth to power, to go out and find the truth about the world and to bring that truth to people who are making decisions here in Washington. And so I think about that a lot now, because I hope that opening up kind of this world, has shed some light on it, hopefully in a fun way, but also it's giving you more ammunition to hold the place accountable to that motto, which is, telling the truth to our leaders and hopefully to us. So I'll stop there, but delighted again to be here and really happy to answer questions. Okay.
While I'm looking for hands up, without any spoilers, tell us a little bit about Moscow X.
Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't set the CIA up, but not my book so well. So the book is really, I'll give you a little bit of kind of how I got to the book is I started writing it, in sort of the months after Damascus Station had come out. And I kind of thought at the time that writing a second book, I'd already done it once, like how hard could it be? And it was COVID times, and it was going to be hard to do travel for research. And so I thought, I'll just set this will be a spy novel set in Texas. And it began as a chase from DFW down to the Big Bend country. And I had Russian defectors in Plano living undercover. I had Russian assassins working out of the cover of a Terminex van. I had, crazy stuff. And I, as I was writing it, I had this voice in the back of my head that was like, I don't know if this is working, but I kind of kept pushing through it. And I eventually sent maybe 100 pages. I mean, so I've been working for a while. I sent 100 pages to my editor at Norton, who is very direct. And he called me maybe a week or so after I'd sent it, and I could instantly kind of tell, just from the way he picked up the phone, this was not a good conversation. And he said, without any preamble, he said, "This is terrible, and you need to throw it away." And so, thus began a fairly dark period for a new writer. And I did feel like there were characters and pieces of that story that kind of worked. And so I took some of the Russians and I put them in Russia. And I thought, let's start there. This is maybe more of a natural environment. And what came out of it was a story where I basically said, let me look at the question of what would it look like if the CIA got really serious about sticking it to Vladimir Putin, which is, a technical term. And so the story, Moscow X, is this kind of fictional component of the CIA's very real Russia house. In the novel, it's run by one of my favorite characters. She's this very colorful and deranged CIA case officer named Artemis Proctor. And she comes up with a plan whereby she's going to make Putin think that a coup is underway when one actually isn't. And so she works with a couple of her officers who are under non-official cover. We call them NOCs. They're under commercial cover, to get close to one of Putin's money men and to try to kind of monkey with the cash. And Putin's money man is this very sort of despicable character, a St. Petersburg banker. He's married to a woman named Anna, who is also a banker, but unbeknownst to the CIA, she is also an intelligence officer for Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. And she's kind of this woman who's playing a game all her own. So it's this kind of cat and mouse story, CIA versus the Russians. It's set in present day Russia amid the war in Ukraine, although it's not about that. And it really became a story, about hopefully all the things that good spy novels are about. So it's about betrayal and love and loyalty and deception and all that. And it's also just kind of a bit of a revenge story set amid the war between Washington and Moscow. So that's Moscow X.
Got one here.
Yes, I have a question about the CIA versus the FBI. Do they ever cross over?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The best. So the FBI is, of course, domestic. CIA is more externally focused. The best way to think about the two of them is that the FBI are cops and the CIA are robbers. So the FBI are like, they're trying to get a conviction, and the CIA is trying to steal information. And if that doesn't sound culturally like it's a good fit, it's because it's not. The two organizations oftentimes clash. But particularly since 9/11, when there were gaps between the two organizations that had disastrous results, there's been a lot tighter connection made. So there are FBI special agents who are embedded inside every mission center. I believe it's still true that our counterintelligence mission center inside the CIA is run by an FBI special agent. There are tons of my former colleagues at CIA who have done rotations and tours at the FBI. So the connective tissue between the two has gotten a lot better over the past couple decades. I mean, of course, again, they're two different places with two different missions and two different cultures, so you're always going to have, friction or gaps, but I think it's gotten a lot better.
Okay, you're going to have to yell. We've got one in this balcony.
I was hoping for easy questions. The question was, how did we get Afghanistan so wrong, and how long can Ukraine hold on? I think on the Afghanistan point, the honest answer is I was so shocked by it. It's still hard for me to understand how we screwed it up that badly. It had been a pretty consistent theme inside all the analysis that I had seen to suggest that, keeping at least a small force to hold Bagram, the airbase there, and a few other places, not that expensive. Our troops were not at tremendous risk, right? It had been a while. I don't remember the exact amount of time. It had been a while since we'd had casualties in Afghanistan. So I think it was a huge misread. It was a massive tactical set of errors on how you actually do the withdrawal, but it was also a complete sort of, I guess, like the withdrawal from Vietnam, where you'd gotten yourself into a position of thinking that these institutions that we had helped support and build and these elites are going to hold on for long enough that by the time it kind of all collapses or erodes, we'll be long gone. And what we didn't realize was that by the time we had signaled it was happening in about April to August, there'd been an entire collapse of morale inside the Afghan security forces and among many elites who just said, we're done. And that happened like that. And so I think there was just a complete misunderstanding and misread of the situation and the strategic situation on the ground. And it was an incredible travesty the way it happened. I think on Ukraine, if I had the answer to that question, I might not need to write any more books. But I have a very dark view at this point of how this is going to go for the Ukrainians. I think when you look at Russian manpower, when you look at how it's ramped up its defense industrial base, when you look at the amount of ammunition it can and military equipment it can replenish and bring to bear. The Soviet Union was not effective at producing consumer goods, but it was effective at producing military equipment, and the industrial base is set up for that. So they've mobilized the society for war. They have more people, they have more resources, they're right next door. And, I think it's fair to say that the political willingness in the US to sort of bankroll this, support it long term is very questionable. So from a Ukrainian standpoint, I think we're already at a sort of de facto partition of the country is what's already happened. And I'm not particularly optimistic that we can turn those trends around anytime soon.
One more? Maybe.
Which country or government poses the biggest threat to us right now, do you think?
I think my view would be China. But it's a kind of a complicated answer because I think that the Russians have done a better job of working some of the weak spots inside our own society and have a long history of doing that all around the world. But I think if I were to pick one, it would be the Chinese. I think they are the closest thing to sort of a near-peer competitor that we have. And even though they're across the Pacific, the best way to think about the United States kind of geostrategically is that we have two borders, the oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and the Chinese are on one other side of it, right? And they have gone through a massive military buildup over the past couple decades. The party has consolidated, and Xi has really consolidated power, in himself. It's the most centralized that Chinese power has been probably since Mao. And I don't know what their intent is. No one does. But the trajectory for the capabilities that they have been investing in and building to sort of push us or to create the capability to keep us away from their borders, South China Sea, from Taiwan. I think we've honestly probably fallen behind in some of the investments that we would need to make, like hypersonics, for example, where it's just, I think it's kind of it's a threatening situation, and one that we need to be very focused on. So I would say China.
Okay, got time for one more.
If the Ukraine falls, will it be a domino effect?
I don't think in that. I don't think that cleanly. No. But I do think that Russia has aims on many different pockets of Central and Eastern Europe, and would like over time, not just kind of in a pure domino effect, but over time, to create a set of countries, governments that are amenable, open to Moscow's influence, and willing to do what the Kremlin wants. So I think that if Putin gets what he wants in Ukraine, slowly over time at tremendous cost, I think it does increase the likelihood that experiment, there's an attempt to replicate that experiment in another part of Europe. Thank you.
All right, David, thank you. That was a great story. Thanks.
Thank you.
Glad to have you back.
Thank you.
Remember, David's going to be upstairs signing books, so go get yours. And we got one left.